So I think what we're going to do is, in the absence of being able to actually properly introduce the net neutrality debate due to the fact that it is so many things to so many actors in so many different regulatory contexts, we are going to just move on to 4 very different perspectives on this debate. And Alyssa Cooper is going to discuss some very early results from a project that she, I, and Ian have been working on, which is actually mapping the advocacy, mass media, and regulatory discourse of net neutrality from 2006 to 2010 in the United States. So this project is a kind of high-level look at what arguments are made about net neutrality, who's making them, and how they move between the advocacy community, the mass media, and then finally the regulators. Following that, Tom Kudrowski, who is sitting next to me, and who's a principal in the strategy department at Ofcom, is going to talk about the UK's response to the sort of changes in the European scene. Wait a second. No, that was
Chris.
I missed Chris. How did I miss Chris?
Because I was distracting you.
You were distracting me. So after Alyssa, Chris will talk about his book, potentially.
No.
Okay. I don't know what Chris is going to talk about. But Chris Marston is are you senior lecturer in...
I am.
Senior lecturer in law at Essex, and the author of a book, apparently. And
It seems.
And what are you going to talk about?
I will respond to the first speaker and set up the third.
All right. That sounds
I'm glad I'm not the third speaker.
I always set up Tom for his views on these things anyway. So.
Okay, so we have a Chris set up for Tom, and then we have...
Sound Oprah-ish, then.
It does sound Oprah-ish, exactly. So and finally we'll have Leslie Regenshade, who's an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, who's going to talk about net neutrality advocacy in Canada. And you get the and now for something completely different slot on the talk show.
Oh, and I have lots of pretty pictures.
I'm setting you up as well in that case. Good.
Really? I didn't come over to Con to get this.
Well, I wrote it in Montreal.
And finally, we will have hopefully a very spirited and interesting discussion about what the 4 speakers are going to present. So, to Alyssa.
Yeah.
Should I just run down this one?
From beginning. From beginning. On the left.
On the left.
Thank you, Microsoft. Okay, so as Allison noted at the beginning, she and Ian and I think many other people, have been really captivated by how heated the net neutrality debate has been in the U.S., how it has mobilized so many different constituencies, and how much press attention it has garnered. I think there's something special about a technology policy issue when there is both a YouTube mashup featuring a U.S. senator, which has had more than 3 million views there, our friend Ted Stevens in the corner, and has also been a feature on the most hallowed news source in the U.S., The Daily Show, with Jon Stewart. And I think, there's been lots of press attention, and we're going to talk about real press attention today, but there's definitely something special about net neutrality that has really gotten all kinds of different constituencies going. We wanted to, with this project, to dig deeper into how the language and the arguments of net neutrality have moved between essentially 3 different discourses. One is the mass media. The second one is advocacy. And so we looked at advocacy materials, including comments to the regulatory agency, to the FCC, blog posts, and white papers from advocacy groups on all sides of the net neutrality issue. And then the third one was the regulatory materials themselves. So we looked at FCC pronouncements, we looked at the notices of inquiry that they've done, the orders that they've put out, and the proposed rules that they've set forth, including most recently what they call the Open Internet NPRM, which deals almost squarely with the net neutrality issue in total. So we sampled from all 3 of these corpuses over the period from January 2006 to January 2010. The the mass media sample was quite broad. We did a sequential sample from 495 mass media articles. And we focused our content analysis mostly on the substantive arguments and to a somewhat lesser extent on the rhetoric and the words that people were actually using in the debate. So today we have some very preliminary findings to discuss. And part of what we hope to do with this is to do a similar analysis of the discourses in the UK and or in the EU to see if what we find is similar or different and whether that kind of matches up with the reality of telecom policy. So I'm going to have two high-level findings to start and then two kind of more detailed findings. Looks interesting. My arrows are eating my words. So the first high-level finding was that as a general matter, we found that arguments about net neutrality seem to move from the advocacy world to the press, and they kind of have a back and forth between advocacy and the press, and then eventually to the regulatory materials. And that seemed to be true for a lot of the different substantive arguments that surfaced throughout our analysis. So to take one example, competition is obviously very relevant to the net neutrality debate, and the question always is there enough competition between broadband providers to forestall the need for regulation or not? And so with that issue, advocates on both sides really stated their positions early and clearly and over again. The press picked it up, and certainly the competition issue got a lot of play in the press. And then eventually the regulators got to it. We really actually didn't see the competition issue addressed in earnest until the Open Internet NPRM, which was just a few months ago, even though this debate has been going on for many years. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule, obviously, and our mass media corpus actually didn't include one of the more famous or infamous press articles where the former CEO of SBC, which was acquired by AT&T, famously said that he wasn't going to let Google and Yahoo use his pipes for free. So obviously sometimes the press can start a debate, but in general what we saw across our substantive themes was this kind of movement. We had a bunch of these themes that emerged, just to touch on a few of them. One was about definitions. There's a lot of discussion around how do you define net neutrality, can it really be defined or not. There was one theme about the history and the future of the Internet, lots of arguments relying on how the Internet has been historically, how it's going to be if we regulate or if we don't. A strong one about competition, regulation, and market forces. There's a lot of discussion about innovation and investment and the relationship between the two, both at the ends of the network and in the core of the network. And finally, there was one about free speech and democracy and the democratizing potential of the Internet. And what we found actually across many of these substantive themes was that opponents' the opponents of net neutrality regulation, when their arguments were based on just letting the market work, those kinds of arguments seem to get taken up in the press more than the corresponding arguments from neutrality proponents. So so the kind of investment is a good example. Opponents would often make this kind of direct statement that regulation impedes investment, and that if we regulate the broadband providers, then they won't continue to build out the network. It's a very straightforward argument. It showed up lots and lots in the press. The sort of countervailing argument from those in favor of regulation was that actually a neutral network is more valuable to people, and therefore if we regulate to keep the network neutral, then it will spur investment because there will be greater demand for this neutral network. It's not as much of a direct argument, and thus I think didn't really appear in the mass media as much as the opponent's argument. And I think this will be something interesting for us to key off of when we compare to the EU, because there's obviously a very strong bent towards free marketeerism in the U.S. And so the fact that those kinds of arguments got picked up very often, I think, will be an interesting point of comparison because the sort of political and economic leanings may not be the same in other countries and other places. Now, free expression and free speech was sort of an exception to this rule. The net neutrality proponents were the ones who really used free expression as a tool to make their argument and to say we need to keep the network neutral in order to protect this amazing explosion of speech that we've had online. That argument made it into the press a lot, and it was primarily an argument of neutrality proponents. So, again, not a hard and fast rule. So getting into some of the more detailed findings, we found that much of the debate, many of the arguments put forth, were about the Internet's history, both its technical foundations, how it has operated, how it has been architected, and also its regulatory foundations and how we've regulated it and other kinds of telecommunications services in the past. And likewise, lots of neutrality stakeholders also wanted to look forward. After looking back, they would say, well, if this is what we've done in the past, then if we regulate or if we don't regulate, this is what will happen to the Internet in the future. And we saw this theme come up over and over again. So on the technical side, the majority of the arguments about the Internet's technical foundation belong to those who were in favor of neutrality regulation. So they would argue that the network has, in fact, been neutral. It was architected in a neutral way. And I think this quote really exemplifies that kind of line of thinking. So this is from Save the Internet, which still is a pro-neutrality advocacy organization. And it's from their website. And they say that net neutrality has been part of the Internet since its inception. Pioneers like Vint Cerf and Sir Tim Berners-Lee always intended the Internet to be a neutral network. So they're sort of directly relying on the cachet of the Internet's forefathers and the web's founder in order to prove their point. The neutrality opponents occasionally actually disagreed with this and would say, in fact, the Internet isn't a neutral system, and would cite all kinds of examples, caching and various arrangements that broadband providers had made or had been making for many, many years to prove that the network actually wasn't neutral. This was something we saw a lot at the very beginning of the debate, or at the beginning of our time period, which is early 2006, and not really much in the middle, but again, very recently. So just some kind of interesting insights about the technical history. On the regulatory side, both the pro and the anti-neutrality camps clung to regulatory history, which on the surface you could think is kind of surprising, because you would think, okay, the technical architecture of the Internet is this giant decentralized system. You can see where there's room for debate. There's these peering arrangements. People don't really know what's in the contracts, all kinds of things where you could say, okay, there could be some room for debate about how the Internet has operated technically. But the letter of the law and of regulation, it's written in black and white. And so how can we possibly debate about how we've regulated the Internet in the past? Well, it turns out that we can at length. And we sort of saw two lines of argument here. One was that the neutrality proponents would emphasize that the Internet grew up on the common carriage telephone network. So when everyone was on dial-up connections, we were riding over the phone network, and the phone network had some pretty stringent, what you could call neutrality requirements because of common carriage. Opponents, on the other hand, would emphasize that the FCC had taken many steps to deregulate the Internet, and they would cite first half of the 2000s kind of things that the FCC had done to deregulate cable and DSL, so the main broadband facilities that U.S. Internet users have. On this one in particular, the proponents' point didn't really seem to permeate the mass media. So this argument about common carriage we didn't see come up in the media nearly so often as the opponent's argument about having deregulated the Internet. And I think you see that a little bit of that here from the Philadelphia Inquirer. This is directly from the article. They said, without government interference, the Internet has proved to be fertile ground for American entrepreneurs, making countless fortunes for investors and private citizens, right? So just taking kind of full stop this notion that the government has not interfered with the Internet in the past. And that's something we saw come up a lot in the mass media discourse. The last point on kind of history and future, and this one sort of links them together, and also gives a little bit of a flavor for some of the rhetorical flourishes that we saw come up a lot. So net neutrality has often been referred to as a solution in search of a problem. Opponents of regulation use this exact phrase in particular, and many others. They would call the net neutrality violations hypothetical. In one case, they called them hogwash. All kinds of colorful verbiage used to get this notion across that there actually isn't anything wrong, and thus there's no regulation needed. And proponents of neutrality regulation would often rebut this directly. And how you sort of came down on this solution in search of a problem issue really depended on how do you define what a problem is. So kind of one strand of this is how many incidents of neutrality violations do you need in order for it to qualify as a problem worthy of regulating. So early on in the debate, there was one incident which was pointed to a lot, which is about this ISP called Madison River, which blocked the VoIP provider Vonage's service, just blocked it entirely. And this example is cited over and over again as if you're in favor of regulation, you say, look, we need to regulate because we can't let ISPs do the kind of thing that Madison River did. And if you are not in favor of regulation, you would say that's one incident, the FCC handled it. It's not enough to warrant regulation. And as the debate kind of evolved over time, there were a few more incidents that came up, became very high profile. Comcast blocking BitTorrent in 2007. Verizon blocked some text messages at one point from an advocacy group. And so depending on which side you're on, you could say, look, we've accrued all of these incidents of discriminatory behavior. On the other hand, you could say it's just a handful. It's not worthy of regulating. There was also some discrepancy about what constitutes an incident. So early on in the debate, as I said, there's this famous article where Ed Whitaker was quoted, complaining about companies using his pipes for free. Opponents of regulation would say, quotes in the press are not discriminatory incidents, and they can say whatever they want, they can threaten whatever they want, but that doesn't mean we need to regulate. Whereas proponents of regulation would often cite this and say, look, these companies are planning to do this, and we need to have the regulator step in to help us out. And then finally, the kind of last point of distinction here was about whether discriminatory incidents actually inflict consumer harm. So if you think about Comcast blocking BitTorrent, well, did that actually harm anyone? Did it cause anyone damage? Opponents would cite this and say, look, no one has been harmed by any of these things that have happened. They've all been resolved quickly. Proponents actually didn't really address the harm issue as much, sort of took it as a given that discriminatory behavior is harming people. And so this is kind of towards the end of the period that we looked at, this argument had gotten, I think, a little bit more nuanced, and that's this quote from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which I would now call an anti-neutrality group, although at the beginning it was more pro. My friend Rob Atkinson maybe would disagree with me, but this is from a paper they did late last year, where they say the ability of the Internet to evolve and to adapt to the needs of new applications and new populations of users is central to its success. It's unwise to declare it a finished system that has to conform to regulations born out of conjecture, speculation, and intellectual combat in its very early stage. So you can still see the kind of reaching towards, look, we're just speculating about what's going on here, and it's not really time to regulate yet, but at least we had gotten a little bit beyond it's just a solution in search of a problem. So one of the other kind of more detailed themes that emerged for us was around the concept of competition, regulation, and market forces. And it's obviously kind of three big topics that are all lumped together, but many of the arguments fed into each other. So opponents would often claim that ISP competition was sufficient to discipline their behavior. So we don't need to regulate because there's enough competition out there. And as I explained at the very beginning, this is one of those arguments that appeared over and over in the press, whereas the proponents kind of countervailing argument that there was not sufficient competition to discipline ISP behavior didn't surface in the press nearly so often. But on this one in particular, there was another interesting twist, which is that the opponent's argument that competition was enough didn't really make it into the regulatory discourse, whereas the proponent's argument that there was not enough competition did make it into the regulatory discourse. And most recently in the open NPRM. So they say here, this is in the text of the notice. So sometimes they had the regulators would issue their own statements, which were often show their bias, but this is actually in the text of the notice. It's unlikely that competitive forces are sufficient to eliminate the incentive to charge a fee, particularly where the imposition of such a fee will not cause the access provider to lose many customers. Thus, allowing broadband internet access service providers to impose access or prioritization fees may inefficiently reduce innovation and investment in content applications and services, generating a suboptimal economic outcome. So you can see there that they took up this notion that there is not enough competition out there in the broadband market to keep ISPs on good behavior. And I think the fact that this argument had been around there in the advocacy discourse since 2006 but didn't show up in the regulatory material until more recently is obviously influenced by a few other things, besides the success of the advocates. We had a change in administration and a change in the makeup of the commission. But I do think it says something about what regulators pay attention to and what the media pays attention to, and whether you're making a simple argument or a complex argument, and how that sort of results in the breadth of the exposure of what you're saying. So this is something that really hadn't gotten picked up until more recently, and obviously someone was paying attention, even though it wasn't really getting talked about a lot in the press. So I'm going to stop there. So we can have my rebuttal or setup for Tom.
Setup should be a nice thing. It's obviously different in different cultures. The way you say it, Chris. In frame.
Does anyone have very specific questions to what Alyssa's mentioned that are unlikely to be sort of further elaborated by the next sets of speakers? Because we can talk a bit about some specific things. Yeah.
Can you just give us maybe 60 seconds on the methodology?
Sure. So we had the sample. We had a sequential sample of about 500 mass media articles, and we did that. We did it timed sequentially so that we would get kind of exposure from all pieces of the debate, and that was from the U.S. and Canada. Was where the
that was
sample
from a
came
Nexus. It was Nexus indexed newspapers, but we actually used 3 different databases: Wall Street Journal, the Nexus main U.S. media, and then also minority media, and then just sampled them all sequentially. And I took 1 out of every 10 because we had almost 500.
Yeah. And then the FCC documents. We basically did every major regulatory document that they've issued in the time period. So except for the broadband plan. So it was basically the ones that focused primarily on net neutrality, the notice of inquiry, the Comcast order, this open internet NPRM, and there was one more, the 700 megahertz auction. But we didn't do the broadband plan ones because they were very broad. And then for advocacy, we had 4 groups, I believe 4 pro groups, 4 anti groups, and we basically took one big substantive set of comments that they had filed with the FCC, one white paper, and one kind of blog post or shorter bit of testimony from each.
Yes. Yeah.
I was probably asleep, but did you actually define what net neutrality was, or did you just assume we all know? I mean, the follow-up question is, are all parties to the debate agreed on what net neutrality means?
Answer to the follow-up question is no. Never.
Is there a working definition that we could start with?
That we in this room could start with, or that
talking about neutrality, we know we said what it was. So I mean, either we know or we don't.
But that's part of the whole framing.
Okay.
Of course, people use
and I like it.
People use it in the way that is most
suitable
for their strategic interests.
I like that word mystical. I'm about to use it.
I mean, in fact, it's really interesting that you bring that up because what you didn't really talk about the definitions, but that was a huge part of our finding, was that there is tremendous debate about the definitions, and the definitions themselves become the ground of political terrain.
So we found we found all kinds of different definitions, and we also found lots of people talking about how it's so hard to define, sort of like the meta definitional issue.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the categories that you were using for the analysis? I mean, I follow up on the methods issues here.
What do you mean about the categories?
Well, when you say you come up with these sort of issues of internet history, competition, regulation, sort of, where did these categories come from? And
they emerged organically from the content analysis. So we didn't really have too many thoughts going in. We had some idea of what we might find, but it was a process. It was through the coding process that they sort of appeared to us.
Yeah, and we did a few techniques to get in, like doing real sort of word searches and looking at the frequency of certain kinds of words to identify the parts of the argument that that eventually became interesting. But it actually was very inductive.
Yes,
as a very definitional process. Any other comments specifically on Alyssa's work? Thank you very much, Alyssa.
Mm-hmm.
Did you pass it to me? Thank you. Is anyone hot or cold?
Everyone must be.
Yes, everyone's.
Are those windows open at the back?
No, the air conditioning is on,
anymore?
but it's not. Usually right now, I don't know why.
I must have broken them when I used to do that.
Okay.
That's right, I'm not trying to cut you all.
But it's an OI axiom that the heat cannot be regulated. How much they investigate cannot be regulated. So
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
However, you could move about the room.
You have freedom of movement. All right, Chris Morrison, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. As you said, I come from the University of Essex and previously at this parish and Cambridge MIT Institute and various other places at one time or another. I'm not going to talk about the book because I actually talk about the book for an hour tomorrow at Google and it'll be on YouTube, and so you can just see what I say about the book. So this is not a blatant advertisement by any means. It is actually.
No, you've done that already.
Sorry?
You did that already.
Well, no, I didn't do that already. I actually, what I'm really doing is actually trying to actually respond to a bit of the debate and help to set it up a little bit more. I mean, one of the fascinations about this debate, first of all, yes, of course, it's clear that the definition of net neutrality is going to be different for whatever your advocacy position is. But we are starting to coalesce around some slightly more substantial consensus around the opinion about what net neutrality might be, although maybe not about who the actors are who are caught by it, and that's where it becomes interesting. People tend to think of this as something which definitely affects fixed ISPs, whether they agree with this or not, maybe affects mobile ISPs, and one has to be very careful about the definition here, because does it affect wireless ISPs in the US? And of course that's a slightly different issue than whether it affects mobile ISPs in Europe, as I found out, partly because of the terms of interconnection and also the kind of networks that are developed. And anyone who's on Interesting People may have noticed that when the book was first launched online, there was a fascinating discussion that took place with a slightly deranged individual called Brett Glass, who is a wonderful man if you agree with him, and has very fixed views about wireless ISPs in the US, and doesn't read the opening paragraphs of chapters. And I should say, one of the fascinations about because the book it's a hardback, obviously. There's no paperback, which is a shame, but at least you have a 40% discount on the hardback there. But the book's also available online for free. And one of the fascinations about it being online for free is it was put online on the 30th of January by Bloomsbury Academic, the academic imprint of Harry Potter, which didn't really market the book at all. So I put it on a couple of listservs and put it on my blog, and it's had 60,000 downloads in the last 6 weeks. And apparently at least 3 of those people have read it. And my fiancée points out that she didn't download anything like that many times, so someone else must have downloaded some of them. But one of the fascinations is when this argument broke out on Interesting People, the day it was actually available on the web, the person who rushed to my defense was actually the technology guy for the ITIF, who had read it by that point, which is impressive. Or actually, this was the second morning, and he lives in California, so he had time to sort of gallop ahead.
Which person?
Name escapes me, actually. It's Harold Richard Bennett, I believe it is.
Okay.
ITIF.
Or IETF.
ITIF.
Okay, ITIF.
And really likes my solution and wants me to come to Washington and talk about it at one of their events. So ITIF are actually, in my view, are actually right in the middle of the debate. And for another reason as well, which is that one of the fascinations about this debate, it's sufficiently complicated that the intellectual input is actually just about feasible, as opposed to 99.999% of the debates in Washington, where it's simply lobbyists throwing rotten fruit at each other. But here you can actually say something sensible. And one of the interesting things is that actually Rob Atkinson wrote a paper with Phil Weiser 3 years ago about a middle way on net neutrality. Phil Weiser has just written, is said to be one of the people, but clearly is the main author, of the of the DOJ's submission to the Internet Inquiry, to the Open Internet Inquiry. You should read the submission. It's superb, and it's fascinating, and it will be very, very close to what comes out as a result. Partly because he is just such an extraordinarily erudite and insightful thinker on these issues. Phil Weiser is a man whose thoughts on broadband regulation are extremely important to the rest of us. So it's a very interesting area. I don't talk about definitions now because the book's full of definitions and explanations of why the definitions have been put in the way that they have been. It begins actually with Barack Obama's definition from a podcast of May 2006 when the junior senator for Illinois dedicated an entire podcast to net neutrality, little realizing the position he would be in a couple of years later. And I should say that some of the things that I'm going to talk about, trying not to twist my neck while I do it, some of the things I'm going to talk about actually relate to an earlier piece of work which actually relates very strongly to Alyssa and Ian's piece of work, which unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been published, by Jeffrey Hart. And it refers to basically the debate up to 2006 and the kind of prehistory of the debate. Of course, the debate completely changed in 2008 in November, when suddenly the United States rejoined the rest of the world when it came to telecommunications regulation, having gone its own way ever since W's appointees decided what they wanted to do with the Telecoms Act of 1996, namely ignore it. They rejoined the rest of the world, which was nice. So we could have a proper debate about things. And Yochai Benkler's contribution for Harvard told us essentially what the rest of the world had been trying to tell Washington for ages, which was, you really do need to introduce a little bit more competition into your local access networks. You do not solve this with a dual. I was asked, actually very nicely by them, this is a sign of the new FCC, to actually put the book in as a submission to that inquiry. And I put the book in, I thought, how interesting, I wonder how many people have submitted to this inquiry. 26,807 submissions at that point.
Wow.
This will be delayed a little while. They cannot get through that many submissions very quickly.
Wow.
If you are very interested in it, there are a couple of submissions you really, really, really should look at. Electronic Frontier Foundation, which says, we like some of what you're doing, we don't like the idea that you're trying to get the ISPs to be copyright police, and by the way, whatever comes out of this, you don't have the authority to do this. And you know you don't have the authority to do this, and this is going to have to go to legislation. And that's the Electronic Frontier Foundation saying this, who actually would normally be actually supportive at least of this, but not supportive of the FCC taking upon itself a very wide ancillary authority to regulate the internet. You should definitely read the paper submitted by Dave Clark, Bill Lair and Steve Bauer. Dave Clark, one of the three authors of the end-to-end principle. Bill Lair, who's the game theorist who's worked with Dave for 20 years. This will be extraordinarily highly regarded within the FCC, and it's a superb paper, so you definitely should read this. You should also read the joint Verizon-Google submission about how much common ground there is between those two companies, which I think will tell you how much consensus is actually breaking out under the surface.
But then you should also read the two separate submissions to see how much difference there is between them.
You should, but if you have more time, you should read the separate submissions and do a little bit of textual analysis there, because you're quite right, that will tell you that there is some common ground and much difference. So there we are. I will later on do a kind of live thingy. Oh, here we are. This appears to have Phil Weiser's prints all over it. That's my comment on the DOJ piece. Okay. YouTube is a glorious thing in many different ways. This is an attempt to actually live connect to YouTube. We'll see how it goes. Net neutrality, we always used to say, was a problem that we have in the United States because they'd basically dumped competition. And so they dumped competition, so they had to have net neutrality to basically inset some measure of free speech within their monopoly or duopoly networks. But it actually came home and started to bite us here in 2006, at the point when it was realised that a lot of throttling was going on by ISPs. And it was throttling of a particularly crude kind. And I'll let this load and then show you a wonderful comment by Charlie Dunstan, who is becoming ever more interesting on these issues. You may know that Charlie have made some wonderful comments about the digital economy, the anti-digital economy bill, which is currently being debated before what
the
remains
CEO
of
of
this
TalkTalk.
Talk. Oh yeah, sorry, for those of you, I don't know how. Can I assume most people in the room are academic? Okay, in which case I will actually say who these guys are as I'm reading them off. So this is the old title of the book. This is the structure of the book. It goes into a whole load of issues. Chapter 4 is all about notice and takedown and ISP liability issues. So this goes far, far away from what many people within the telecoms industry conceive of as the debate. It also goes far beyond what many people within the if you like, the First Amendment crowd think of as the debate as well. I also talk a lot about deep packet inspection and interception and the issues that occur there because of some of the interesting security questions that arise when ISPs are asked or choose to start looking inside packets and beyond the headers. Namely, they start pretty quickly A, breaking the law, and B, exposing themselves to all kinds of liabilities that they don't have as simple intermediaries. And I also talk about the debate up until about September of last year. And the conclusion is towards a co-regulatory solution, which is why on Monday we were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Ian organised a fantastic workshop on the future of the Internet, for which, if you want to know the background to the net neutrality debate, you should read the first phase report from that project. And on Monday, I was told, we like what you're writing, and you're going to have to explain to people in the States what co-regulation is, because they're doing it and they don't know it. Because they just brand everything as self-regulation if it doesn't actually come directly from the legislation. So we'll maybe come on and talk about that a little bit later on. That's it, I'm not going to talk about the book. But I am going to talk about the origins of this debate. And Jeffrey Hart's article actually directed me to a wonderful paper by Ellie Noam. Ellie Noam from Columbia University Business School wrote about the impending doom of common carriage in 1994. And he explained that he was regretted to predict that what was going to happen was the common carriage element of telecommunications, public telecommunications operators, which had existed since the beginning of public telecommunications and which has a much longer history than that, going back into railways and canals and pubs and blacksmiths and you name it, was going to come to an end because it was going to be a model which converged on two models. An internet model that was end-to-end but didn't have to be and would adjust as technology adjusted, and a cable television model which was extremely vertically integrated, extremely controlled, and extremely closed. And he saw that it was likely. Ellie is someone who has a very deep insight into the ways of Washington and regulation and has a high regard for the lobbying abilities of telecommunications companies. So he basically saw that both telecoms and the internet were going to get garroted by the lobby that wanted to move us towards a cable TV model. So he regretted that death. But actually, and lo and behold, what happened eventually is that all of telecommunications operators, or large chunks of the telecommunications operators' activities, were reclassified as Title I, not Title II under the Communications Act, which means that most of their common carrier obligations were removed, which is where we sit today as a result of some cases that were decided in the middle of the W void. But the debate's actually much older, of course. And one of the things that I want to pick up on is this mystical comment that Yorick made, because there's a lot of work that's been done on the way in which technology is deployed and developed and adopted by society. Starting off from the almost mythical transformative power that is suggested by technology when it's first introduced, and it becomes increasingly a mundane technology which has much greater reach in terms of its ubiquity, but which is much more made to conform by governments and by corporations to the kind of business models and regulatory models that they have in place for previous technologies. And we see this not just in communications, but much more broadly. And in fact, it's fascinating to read some of the early work, some of the early cases about patents for electricity, and some of the different ways in which visionaries saw electricity transforming the world, and in which Edison saw a way of making a quick buck, and the kind of points in between that. So Ithiel de Solar Pool's work, of course, is very, very well known in the communication studies field. Less well known, this work, rather than this person. Ronald Coase wrote a wonderful book in 1950 when he was still at the London School of Economics, as sort of senior lecturer at the time, 12 years after he had written about transaction cost analysis. The BBC, A Study in Monopoly, in which one entire chapter is actually an interview that he conducted with Lord Reith. An astonishing interview in which Coase and Reith found that their worldviews were entirely separated. If you think that Coase got in trouble for his spectrum auction analysis in the 60s, you want to see what Reith said to him in 1950 about the concept of competition in communications. But also, let's go further back. The Kingsbury Commitment that was made by AT&T, where it actually promised that it would maintain the universal service which had been created by competition between rival telecommunications networks up to that point, and it said that as it gobbled up or agreed to leave alone various different local companies, it would nevertheless maintain that universal service obligation, which had actually been created by competition before then. And Milton Mueller's work on the universal service is fascinating about the extent to which all they were doing was agreeing to keep in place a universal service obligation, which actually had been created, well, not obligation, but universal service commitment, which had been made really by competition in the first place. And going much further back, William Ewart Gladstone and the Railways Act of 1844, one of probably the first, I say modern in the sense of an elaboration of the economics of networks that we can understand very clearly today, and an elaboration of the failure of monopoly network operators, and the need to introduce elements of not just common carriage, but elements of price regulation into those monopoly networks in order to ensure that a basic service existed for the poor, from which we get the parliamentary trains that people have probably only heard about from a song in, is it the Mikado? Am I correct? Is that the, right, thank you. It's good to be at Oxford. So there's a final point to make about this. Common carriage, of course, is a telecoms and utility concept, not an internet concept. Common carriage is not about everyone travels for the same price. It is not about information is free. Common carriage is about what we in the competition law business talk about as being FRAND. It is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory treatment. That is not free, and that is not everyone travels for a flat price. That is, a bag of coal will cost the same as a rival's bag of coal, and an apple will cost the same as a rival's apple to transport, and a third-class ticket will cost the same as another third-class ticket. But within that, there is a great deal of discrimination offered by common carriage. And so given that one of my conclusions is actually that we should reintroduce common carriage for broadband internet, I just want to make that very important point, that FRAND is nothing like what some people have portrayed common carriage as. This is what common carriage really is. It's not a free ticket, or even a 1 penny ticket. So, on we go. And the net neutrality debate actually starts in 1999 before we even have the expression. The modern net neutrality debate. And it starts with the merger of various cable TV and broadband companies, and particularly the merger of AT&T, which was then a long-distance company. Of course, it's now been transformed into a branding for a southern US regional monopoly, which has outgrown its original San Antonio roots. And it merged with Media One, and of course AOL was in its mega merger with Time Warner at the same time, which had some actually very interesting, sophisticated conditions placed on it as regards instant messaging. But at the time of these mergers, Lawrence Lessig and Mark Lemley made a submission to the FCC called the End of End to End, in which 10 minutes? Tell me when it's 2 minutes in, and then I'll just do a big finish. I'll just scrap everything else. And what they were saying is, we are concerned that the architectural design principle of end-to-end, which has, as a byproduct, ensured a great deal of liberty to those at the end of the network to ensure that there's no fiddling with their expression in the middle of the network, to put it into extraordinarily crude and non-technical terms, this will be affected if these internet companies become cable companies. So they worried about the business model of the cable TV company being projected onto the internet company. I think there's a merger going on at the moment in the States, Comcast and NBC. Well, there we are. How these things come back to bite us. This was before, by the way, Lessig wrote Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. So this is a very interesting paper. It emerged as an academic article in 2001, but it was originally a submission to the FCC. One of the things that I think I must make, which is very point I must make, which is very important, is that the end-to-end principle, quote, is an architectural design principle from 1984. And Dave Clark in particular has been very worried about how in the early stages of the net neutrality debate, he actually has referred in a paper to the end-to-end principle is an architectural design principle from 25 years ago, and he is distressed by the, quote, Talmudic reverence with which it is treated by lawyers who should ask him and know better about the extent to which computer scientists would quite like to introduce quality of service into the network. And someone put it to me as the quality of service is the ship upon which, or the sea upon which 1,000 PhD theses were launched in computer science. It's something that is seen as being a good, not a bad. And so some of the original net neutrality comments that said, we must outlaw quality of service, were greeted with, well, you might as well just outlaw network engineering then. Nice. Ridiculous idea. This is the fear. You've seen probably a longer version of this. This is much easier to digest. For $30, you get internet access to Disney, of course, the mouse, eBay, MSN, people are willing to pay to be there. The tier of cable channels on the internet that you might expect. For $40, you can get some of the other guys, some of the rich guys and maybe one of the non-rich guys that just looks good to have there. Google, Yahoo, probably one or the other I would have thought, and not Bing's there already, and vice versa. I'd ought to be a pro-Googler. And maybe Wikipedia. But for $50, you can start getting stuff that you can actually produce yourself. You can actually get YouTube and Blogger and MySpace and probably Facebook, although, well, anyway. So you can get all these extra things as you go up in tiers. Well, this isn't the internet we have today, right? So that's the worry. 2000 debate, and this just maybe goes takes it up to your period. 2002, telecoms competition in the US is effectively removed by the courts and the Republican Federal Communication Commission. Lessig and his, at the time, star student Tim Wu, graduate of McGill, wrote to Congress, and they feared the cable TV business model was once again taking over. This is 3 years after the original paper. Wu coins the term net neutrality in 2003. He goes on to expand it, of course, with his famous or controversial or infamous, depending on your perspective, wireless Carterphone paper of 2007. And the FCC, well, I mean, Michael Powell makes a speech and says, wouldn't it be nice if people could still use the internet and everyone was nice to each other? And then the FCC says, yes, we agree. All of us think, wouldn't it be nice if everyone introduced these things and did it? And last year, when he was interim chair of the FCC, Michael Copps, who seems to be the sanest person in Washington from what I can see, said, well, if you're not going to actually introduce enforcement as a condition, it's just nonsense. And so what's being suggested, particularly by the Jenichowski speech before they launched the NPRM last autumn, was, I think we probably should include maybe enforcement, otherwise it's just hot air. Together with a non-discrimination condition, which could be completely an empty vessel or could be quite interesting. Congress fails to legislate 2005 to 6, where we heard that before. Congress has also failed to legislate so far 2009 to 10, and will probably have to legislate at some point in 2010, or we will have the new contract with America in 2011, and we have no chance of there being congressional legislation in this area. So don't assume this thing's going to happen. In fact, I would have thought the odds are against it happening in the US. But, and then of course we have the junior senator from Illinois springboarding to world fame and now world derision in such a short period. But that's the States. And if you're a lawyer at least, it's not interesting because nothing's happening. There's a lot of hot air. But there is really interesting stuff going on in Canada, and there is really interesting stuff going to happen in Europe. This is Tom and Leslie. Partly because of the glorious afterthought of the declaration on net neutrality that the European Commission introduced, which I like to think of as a kind of poison pill left by Commissioner Reding to her successor. This is going to be really awkward because I've got to say, and Tom will talk more about this, but look, the new commissioner and her cabinet are almost all from a competition background in DG competition. And they're dealing with a whole load of stuff which is so far outside their comfort zone. It's going to be really quite dramatic, their learning curve this year. And we'll see the pictures up tomorrow anyway. But I'm sure that quite a few people are going to turn up and say nothing. We shall see what they think of what I say. So what's new? Internet's an open network, telecoms regulated by common carriage, rights of way, universal service, and permitting encryption and not trying to stop it. We're part of that. Discrimination on a telecoms network, most of it amounts to interception. So as you'll know, one of the interesting attempted uses of DPI in the past, deep packet inspection, was the attempt by Form and BT to trial deep packet inspection for behavioural advertising. And not perhaps over-surprisingly discovering that for various different reasons, both for data protection on a European and UK level and also for interception of communications on a UK level, they were really very obviously breaking the law. 2 minutes now. We'll go up. This is going to be quick. All right, so lots of legal obstacles. I won't do the law stuff because there's probably not many lawyers in the room. There are lots of legal reasons why this may or may not be a good idea. Emphasis on the may not. And that's those things. Co-regulation, I think we'll probably get to in Q&A, because I do want to, rather than get to questions and comments, just show you, just as a last 90 seconds thing.
Is the audio working? Check that.
How do I check?
Well, press play.
Oh, you mean just this? No, because there is lots and lots of magic under this desk, which I always knew didn't work properly. That's the guy from Google who said absolutely nothing about net neutrality. It's really tragic. That's Rudolf van der Berg, who asked a question which they didn't understand. That's Charlie, as if he's about to be put on the spot. And let's turn the volume up. Ooh, let's turn the volume up. Is that it?
You scroll there, yeah, you might be able to get it a bit louder if you hit the, yeah.
That's maximum. Oh, everyone
just has to listen carefully.
No one breathe out for the next minute.
As the person with the pipe, I'm afraid you're a long way down the food chain from someone like Rakesh. So it's very important for customers that they have access to Google, the supplier of the pipe, to a great extent as a commodity. So if you don't give access to Rakesh's content, but you try and charge people, or you try and charge Rakesh and he won't pay you, you actually don't have much leverage. Because if you say to your customers, it's all great, but join our service, but you can't access Google, you're not going to have very many customers for very long. You have to understand where you sit.
And then he says this.
Does anyone else want to start it out? As a little bit bizarre. Some service providers.
I'm making a comment at this point about the fact that ISPs are blocking BitTorrent, not Kazara, got that wrong, and therefore people couldn't upgrade World of Warcraft, and asking whether anyone had complaints from their customers that they couldn't actually play the game that they're subscribing to. So stop waffling, Marsden, and let's actually listen. There's Charlie thinking, am I going to actually tell the truth about this? And he does, much to his regulatory director's embarrassment. What's the cable guy definitely not going to answer? Bear with me, I'm enjoying my own voice too much at this point. And this was 1st of December, well actually it was November 2006, I think, mid-November. So I asked them. Charlie falling off the desk.
I don't know whether any of the panel feel qualified to answer such a question. The panel has unanimously decided. Yeah, the panel has unanimously decided that's too difficult. So, could I just say that the problem is that people.
You again.
Well, no, because they said no one wants to answer the question. Someone's going to have to answer it. Can we shut off the air conditioning for a second? Thanks.
I'll answer that a tiny bit. I don't understand the issue completely, but we do shaping of traffic to try and restrict peer-to-peer users, and I do know I get hate mail at home from people who play games when that means you restrict their ability to be able to play games, and our team find it extremely difficult to try and restrict people who are doing huge amounts of peer-to-peer file sharing. And we get letters from Warner Brothers and people saying that we're aiding and abetting people stealing their content, and then at the same time to try and distinguish them against someone who's playing a particular game. I know it's an issue. I've got two people at home that they can kill me as a result of not allowing them to play certain games, and within our organisation everyone is scratching their heads trying to figure out. So from our point of view, it isn't security, it's about how you distinguish what type of traffic.
3.5 years ago. And there the problem is appreciated as not being an American problem. However, we still haven't got anywhere with it, but at least we understand that there is a, how should we put it, a consumer issue here as well as a content and copyright issue. Sorry, I carried on a little bit too far, but I just thought it's just nice, isn't it? I love the moment when he tries to slide under the desk. I think that's just, and he was the only person with the guts to answer the questions.
Thanks very much, Chris. Does anyone have a really specific question for Chris, or shall we let Tom talk a bit about what is currently happening in the European and UK context? Right,
Okay.
that's you.
Thank you very much. I don't have any slides, but I thought Elise's covering of the issues and Chris's actually have sort of set up the discussion very nicely, and at least you now know where the net neutrality debate stemmed from. But clearly it is no longer sort of US special issue, although people are obviously very passionate about it over there. It's one that affects, I think, the whole world. It's not just Europe. There's also been a wide-scale debate about this, and continues to be in Japan, for example, and in Asia and other Asia-Pacific markets. But clearly, the sort of policy and the regulatory framework in which different operators and different players and consumers and prosumers indeed exist does matter, and it is very different. And you can understand why in the 2000s, why it came to such a head, and why you suddenly started seeing all these articles on net neutrality, because suddenly you were faced with, after the courts had ruled that there was no longer any need for wholesale access, literally members of the CTIA, you know, these sort of new entrants, had their equipment pulled out in exchanges by the telcos within 24 hours. It was quite brutal. And all those sort of non-discriminatory obligations just went out of the window. And so people said, well, what's going to happen now? You've got the cable operators, you've got a limited number of telcos, there is a vertically integrated system of delivery of internet access. Your ISP is your telco or your cable operator. That's pretty much it. What's going to happen to the access of the content? Are we only going to have selected access to certain types of websites rather than an open internet? And what does this mean for all those great software application service providers who have uploaded content over the internet? Are they going to be charged? And if they are going to be, and if they refuse to pay, are they going to be blocked? Is it going to be preferential treatment? And so the whole debate shifted to the IP layer, that something needs to be done on net neutrality. Now the reason, obviously, that debate did not kick off in Europe, and why there's been a lag in the debate, is that clearly there are quite a lot of non-discriminatory requirements placed on electronic communications providers, ISPs and telcos, throughout the EU, including the UK. There are obligations of non-discrimination, there are price controls. It's a very detailed and well-developed regime that has existed for a long time. There's unbundling obligations, there's different types of bitstream access products that have to be provided. So whilst at one point in the 1990s, actually there seems to be a lot of convergence between the US and the European regulatory regimes, there was obviously, as Chris mentioned, this divergence. And so many sort of policymakers in Europe were scratching their heads and thinking, well, why should we sort of really address this debate? Because we're already addressing the issues of competition. And that's obviously based on a framework which is very much based on competition law principles and the idea that if you are a dominant player, that you shouldn't be allowed to discriminate as just any other normal market player. That's obviously on the basis that most policymakers do not think that all discrimination is a bad thing, that actually some forms of discrimination can indeed be consumer welfare enhancing and not necessarily be destructive. And I think economists such as Hal Varian, for example, who developed in the 1990s theories around versioning and second and third degree price discrimination sort of concur with that view. So what was the policy in that context of Ofcom? Well, Ofcom said that obviously it would promote competition, and when it came into existence in 2004, it launched the Strategic Review of Telecommunications, and this led to the development of the undertakings with BT, which a former colleague of mine, a lawyer, described as non-discrimination on steroids, which was, of course, the undertakings which led to the functional separation of BT and the creation of the OpenReach Access Division, as well. In complement, all the sort of regulatory remedies that sort of coexisted with that under the EU framework, such as local loop unbundling and wholesale broadband access. And we thought that was a good place to start. And if you looked at the retail broadband market, that was very competitive. You had an incumbent with one of the smallest retail, if not the smallest retail market share of any incumbent in Europe, at around, well, it's varied over time, but between sort of 25 and 30%, and dozens of different ISPs. There's obviously a core number of about 4 or 5 ISPs now that have the vast majority of customers, but there's still a lot of niche ISPs out there offering different types of services. So a very, very different landscape to the US. And the other obvious big difference, I guess, with the US is the nature of cable. Cable is significant in the UK. It passes around 47 to 48% of homes, but obviously is not as extensive as in some US states, where cable is much more ubiquitous than that, and indeed in certain European markets where cable is quite extensive, most notably in the Netherlands.
We have Murdoch, of course, instead.
And Murdoch has actually done a fantastic job of offering, I think, a lot of innovative services to consumers, and took a hell of a risk, which could have actually sunk the whole Sky thing back in the 1990s. And is now, interestingly enough, subject to a review by us and proposals for wholesale access obligations in the pay TV market. So that was the sort of competition element of our policy up till then, and the sort of corollary to that was an emphasis that if markets are going to work, consumers need to be aware of what's going on. So another sort of bulwark of our sort of approach to net neutrality is great advocacy of consumer transparency. In other words, if you are going to put restrictions on consumers, then they should have a right to know that that is indeed happening, and that subsequently that they have a choice, and B, that they exercise that choice in being able to switch provider. And this affected our approach both to fixed ISPs and to mobile. So in the case of mobile, there were various mobile network operators who said that they didn't want to carry VoIP services, particularly Skype service, because they considered that it directly competed with their existing voice offerings. Now, Skype will obviously tell you that they actually think that they complement them, and that they're not directly substitutable, and therefore that's a spurious argument. We can talk about that. But there was a new entrant that came into the market, Hutchinson, owned by Hutchinson Whampoa, who sort of broke ranks and did offer Skype as part of its service, and that was a very important sort of element of a sort of competition dynamic in action. And we felt that so long as there was indeed that sort of choice, that was sufficient, and there wasn't a need for intervention. The other thing worth saying as well is that under the EU rules, under EU competition rules, it is quite difficult for any regulator, and every regulator will admit this, to actually prove coordinated effects through tacit collusion amongst operators. So even if we considered that there had been a problem and the competition wasn't effective amongst the mobile network operators, it would be very difficult under the regime to prove that that was the case. And I don't think much has changed in that respect. Then another issue sort of blew up in terms of consumer transparency was around the whole area of the advertising of broadband services, most of which wasn't particularly sophisticated, wasn't based on different types of services that you could receive based on the sort of broadband access you could get, but was based on broadband speeds. And there were loads of campaigns saying that you could get up to 8 megabit broadband, which might be quite funny for somebody living in the capital of South Korea, Seoul, where they've had much higher speeds till then. But anyway, up to 8 megabits was advertised.
Vodafone's 14.4 megabits mobile advertising 18 months ago would have even impressed the Koreans.
Yeah, there you go. And what actually turned out to be the case was, unless you were sitting directly inside a BT exchange, the idea of getting 8 megabits...
Or up a mobile tower.
Was highly unlikely.
In the exchange.
To cut a long story short...
Oh, and having killed all of your neighbours as well.
And so to cut a long story short, we sort of realised this. There's actually loads of things inside a sort of home or a business and in terms of the network, which means that in reality you are not going to get up to 8 megabits. In fact, there are many parts of the country where some exchanges you couldn't get more than 2 megabits. And we actually worked with an organisation called Sam Knows here in the UK to sort of find out what the sort of average speeds people could get. And the reality wasn't up to 8 megabits. It was something like, I can't remember the exact figure, but I think it was something like 3.4. That's the number I've got roughly in my head. Don't quote me on that, but it was something in that region. So what did we sort of do to address that? Well, we got round the table and had quite tough negotiations with the other ISPs, starting off with the bigger ones and then working our way through the sort of list of ISPA members, the Internet Service Provider members, who've now signed up to a voluntary code which says that at the point of sale and during the term of the contract, you have to let people know, at least give some sort of indicative idea of what speeds they're likely to get. But crucially in that code, it also says that any sort of traffic management has to be made unavailable to consumers. Now, having said that, that's pretty much all that code says on that subject. It doesn't go into much detail. It gives huge scope for all the different ISPs to interpret that as they will. It doesn't guarantee that there is particular prominence given to that information. And very recently, we've conducted mystery shopping into the compliance of the ISPs with this code. And I'm delighted to say that our policy executive has decided to publish the results of that mystery shopping. I think it'll be coming out next week. I think that's the publication. I think it'll be around the 23rd. So I think that's really good news, and I'm sure all the ISPs in the country will be absolutely delighted that we're going to do that with all the consequences that will have. My only disappointment is that unfortunately the policy exec has decided that we're not going to do it by name of individual ISPs. It'll only be general.
Oh,
so that's
and is it only fixed as well? It's not mobile.
I'm not quite sure actually who signed up to the code. So I'd have to check.
They're all anonymous, so it doesn't matter anyway.
Yeah. So that's a pity. That's a pity. But it does give some food for thought about what is effective, what we mean by consumer transparency, and how you make it work. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters now because there's been a very long negotiation on the regulatory framework under which all national regulators in Europe operate, the EU framework review. It's now in place. It's part of the European legal framework, and it has to be transposed by all member states by next summer, by 2011. And we will have to work with the government to ensure that that's transposed effectively. Now, there are some very interesting changes within that regime which directly impact on the net neutrality debate here in the UK and in the rest of Europe. There are new powers that NRAs have to impose consumer transparency obligations on communications providers. There are rules around consumer switching. Very interestingly, there's a new power to allow NRAs to impose minimum quality of service on communications providers. And all these powers are symmetric. And by that, I mean that they are not based on the finding of significant market power. So we'll be able to impose it on all electronic communications, regardless of their size, within the UK. Another interesting development in another part of the EU framework is the fact that up till now we could hear disputes between different interconnecting communications providers. But now, under Article 20 of the Framework Directive, other parties will be able to raise disputes against electronic communications providers. So potentially, not naming any names, but a broadcaster, internet service provider, an application software provider will be able to complain directly to us, and we will have to consider that dispute. Now, that does not fill our lawyers with great delight, because they're rather busy at the moment with a number of appeals. That certainly increases the burden significantly on all regulators. But if you sort of combine one set of rules with that sort of can change the dynamic quite significantly.
You should explain for non-Europeans that won't be the law until May 2011 in the member states.
But we still have to think about it, which is why we plan to launch certainly a consultation here in the UK, what our chief executive has described as a late spring. We have a very broad definition of the seasons in Ofcom, I'm glad to say.
Very long winter.
So I suspect that what we'll have is a sort of a first sort of very green discussion document published sometime in June. We'll hold a series of public workshops to coincide with that. I mean, in fact, we're already having sort of pre-consultation discussions with those who want to come and see us already. Our door is always open. I don't think anyone can complain about not having access to Ofcom. And then we will then develop more detailed proposals over the summer and probably have a second consultation in the autumn, or it'll feed directly into the work that the Department of Business Innovation and Skills will be doing in relation to the transposition of the EU framework. So that's roughly what we're doing here and what's going on. Simultaneously, the BEREC, which is the body of European regulators, which succeeds the European Regulators Group, has also set up a net neutrality project team. I was at their inaugural meeting last month, and I've now sort of handed over responsibility to the international team to deal with the sort of day-to-day matters, but obviously with a lot of input from my team into the substance of what they're doing. And they have sort of very similar, very parallel work streams to the ones that Ofcom has, in terms of looking at the competition powers and the new powers that I've listed around consumer transparency and what it means. There'll be a questionnaire going around all the European regulators to see what they're doing. And the idea is that BEREC will produce its final report, and it will be published in December. Not to be outdone, of course, the European Commission also plans to issue a sort of a report. It's committed to actually providing a report to the European Parliament by this summer, and so there's likely to be a communication from them sometime in June. There's going to be a telecommunications council in June, and no doubt that they will have something to say on net neutrality as well. And obviously that will mean that there will be quite a lot of advocacy going on from all parties, information being sought. It's quite interesting, actually. I think it would be great if OII did a sort of subsequent sort of thing after you've done the work on the US to compare and contrast with Europe.
No, that's the next phase of the project.
Great stuff.
So.
Great stuff. So then we can then open this up to discussions after everyone's spoken. But there are obviously a lot of detailed questions, what this means in practice. What does a minimum quality of service mean? How do you impose it? When should you trigger it? When you're talking about consumer transparency, is it enough to sort of, for a regulator, to set out the high-level principles and then leave it to the industry to work out the detail, or does it require more prescription? Can you leave it to a self-regulatory solution? Do you need a co-regulatory solution with backstop powers from the regulator? Should we impose it as a general condition? These are all the sorts of questions that we're asking at the moment, and I look forward to hearing your views. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. All right, so does anyone have any very sort of specific, substantial questions for Tom on the issue?
One quick question. The new framework power, meaning you don't need to determine significant market power to impose conditions, does it require you to impose the same conditions on everybody, or are you allowed to take market power into consideration, so you could have different conditions for small ISPs versus big ones?
It doesn't work like that. I mean, what you can do is you can obviously, if somebody's got SMP, you would use that regime to impose powers on them.
So the SMP regime will still exist?
The SMP regime will obviously exist, but then there will be, in addition, a non-SMP regime. And I couldn't really see why you would sort of then start differentiating.
Okay,
in that
well,
respect.
I have some thoughts, but we'll leave that for a
Yeah,
moment.
yeah.
So okay, thanks so much.
Can I?
Yeah.
It's a clarification because, and I think this will be useful for people because Tom and I have done a lot of work on co and self-regulation over the last years, and it may the definitions may surprise people a little bit. So when Tom, you were talking about having to have some tough talking with the ISPs and then them producing a voluntary self-regulatory code, that is self-regulation because there was no actual power that Ofcom could. The power was bully pulpit as opposed to actually being able to bring powers that were delegated by legislation to play.
Well,
that is self-regulation, at least in terms of the formal
we have
labelling.
to be clear on this. If we had chosen to, we could have imposed a general condition under the existing framework. We don't need these new additional powers, actually, to do that. But we decided that we would give self-regulation a chance. But, obviously, during those discussions, it was made clear to the industry that if it wasn't effective, that might change subsequently.
Which is useful because people need to know that there are varieties of self-regulation and varieties of co-regulation and really grey areas between the two.
I think that I'd really like to talk about self-regulation, co-regulation, and all of the nuances between them. But I think it would be most prudent to let Leslie speak to the Canadian situation, and then it will involve a larger debate. No one is using this room after 4 p.m., so if people have to run off, please. Oh, you are?
Phil different
okay.
PGP and some of the students will be here.
Okay, so we do have to be out by 4, is that
4:20.
Okay, right. So what I wanted to establish is that we will have time to have, a bit of a proper discussion. Thank you, Michael.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much. It's great to meet Alison's new colleagues and to find out all about mushy peas. I'd never said this. What I'm going to do is talk a bit about what's happening in Canada vis-a-vis net neutrality and some initiatives that the CRTC, our Ofcom, like regulator, has done, and talk a bit about some of the advocacy in Canada about net neutrality, and show you a lot of pretty pictures about things that are happening. This is Honorable Conrad W. von Finkenstein, who is the chairman of the CRTC, and he's actually a very incredibly wonderful, interesting intelligent man. No, I'm not. I think he's a very interesting person. But in 2007, he was giving a keynote talk to an annual telecommunications summit where all the big industry bigwigs go because they're the only ones that can afford to pay the $800 plus registration. And he announced, under the heading of net neutrality, a whole range of questions affecting consumers and service providers is involved. Fundamental issues of technology, economics, competition, access, and freedom of speech are involved. It is one of the most polarizing issues of the day, and it will have to be addressed and debated by all. And a bunch of net neutrality advocates were very excited that Conrad made this announcement. Net neutrality debates in Canada started a lot less slower than in the U.S., I think. One of the big sort of issues that raised the specter of net neutrality was when telecommunications blocked a website that was set up by the Voices for Change community website run by the union, the labor, who were having a dispute with the union. And the laborers said that the blocking the site was censorship. It unintentionally blocked a whole bunch of other websites for people that had the ISP from TELUS. And so this brought up a big issue about net neutrality in Canada. In 2006, modernization of the telecommunications framework, high-level group got together to write this very lengthy report, the Telecommunications Policy Review Panel, and there was a brief mention of net neutrality in one of the recommendations, as you can see here. And they talked about amending the Telecom Act to reflect a sort of a light net neutrality approach. At the same time that the TPRC happened, a few of us got some money from our academic funding body and put together a alternative telecommunications workshop for public interest groups. And in this workshop, we suggested that there should be another more serious look at net neutrality, and there should be a more specific provision. But it went nowhere. Now, this is 2006, 2007. This is a screenshot from the Tyee, which is a online newspaper out of Vancouver. Canada sleeps through war to save the internet. There's a lot of, we need to be doing what the U.S. is doing. We're very slow on the mark here. And what is this debate, and why is there all this exciting parties and whatnot in the U.S. about this? Now, the net neutrality debate opened up in 2008 when the CRTC launched a public inquiry into internet traffic shaping policies of Canadian service providers, and this was as a result of a complaint by the Canadian Association of Internet Providers, CAPE, that said that ISPs were, the smaller ISPs were being traffic shaped in terms of retail services, and they were very upset about this, so CRTC decided to open up a hearing for this. At this point, mobilization and net neutrality started to happen. SaveOurNet.ca, based kind of on the Save the Net campaign in the U.S., was started up, and they initiated a very widespread email and letter campaign to the CRTC to look at the issue and to advocate for net neutrality. SaveOurNet.ca has about 150 different sorts of organizations that are involved in it, and a statement of principles and whatnot. Unlike the U.S., so there isn't that much money for advocacy groups. We don't have that infrastructure for the media reform sorts of things that are happening in the U.S., so it's very much volunteer basis. But lots of members, not-for-profit organizations, tons of individuals, labor organizations, academics, so on and so forth, have joined this group, and they've taken a very active leading role in Canada in terms of advocacy. There's a lot of grassroots advocacy. YouTube videos put up. I Hate Bell, referring, of course, to one of the main telecommunications providers in Canada. This has now been taken down. I tried to see if it was up. I don't know if this small kid was put up to the task of talking about why he hates Bell, but you know, it's kind of interesting what's used in terms of empathy. There was a net neutrality rally on Parliament Hill at one point in 2008 that brought together quite a lot of people. And this was in May, so the weather was nice, the snow was gone. And it brought together lots of just ordinary-looking, kind of maybe non-geeky types of people that were out there rallying on Parliament Hill for this. it included these two wonderful high school students who skipped school. And my future includes net neutrality. How much are you willing to pay to meet me on Facebook or whatnot? That is.
I don't like talking about Facebook.
Yeah, well, we won't talk about Facebook, but that is a bit creepy, actually. But I didn't. Opposition groups came out against net neutrality. Now, in Canada, we have a minority government, and we have many opposition parties. And actually, we're back in Parliament now after doing our pierogi vacation for a while. But this is NDP MP Charlie Angus, New Democratic Party, and he's the digital critic, and he's quite wonderful. And he's from Northern Ontario, so he advocates a lot for rural and remote access. So he came out in Parliament talking about net neutrality and that we needed principles for this. The decision came out November of 2008. CRTC allows Bell to continue internet throttling. I'm curious whether the language of traffic shaping and throttling and whatnot are being used in the EU and the UK context, because they certainly are in Canada. So essentially the CRTC said, hey, Bell's not breaking any rules. They can do exactly what it is that they're doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, they announced a hearing on net neutrality. And this was very exciting for many people because this was a really interesting initiative. So it was the review of the internet traffic management practices of internet service providers. Now, there were a lot of questions that asked in the overview of what they were going to talk about. So here's just a few of the questions. In terms of internet traffic management practices, what is the impact of end-to-end users and the use of peer-to-peer and video consumption and network congestion? What are some of the technical and economic solutions? They were also curious to look at what was happening in the international stage. They wanted to have opinions about the former decision that they just made, whether that was reasonable or not. Then they looked at our Telecommunications Act and the specific sections of that and asked a series of questions about that. So Section 27(2), which prohibits any Canadian carrier from unjustly discriminating, subjecting any person to undue or unreasonable disadvantage, or giving an undue or unreasonable preference towards any person, including itself. I love the way these things are written. In relation to the provision of a telecommunications service, would ISP traffic management result in such unjust discrimination? Related to Section 36, about Canadian carriers not controlling the content or influencing the meaning or purpose of telecommunications carried for it by the public, could ISP traffic management practices result in the resultant control or influence of content? Under what criteria should the Commission authorize such practices? And related to Telecommunications Act Section 47, about the objectives of Section 7 of the Act, which are the policy objectives, which say that yes, the market is there. I know you're looking this up.
No. I'm checking my source. That's all.
Oh, okay. Well, we can trade notes later about this because I know that you were in Canada when this was happening. But it's all about the sort of let the market forces rule. What specific internet traffic management practices are raised in regard to this section, and how should it be implemented in the least intrusive manner? Now, the policy process was kind of excruciating, and there were many different steps. And it's often, you make a comment about, you submit something, and then you make a comment about all of the submissions that were submitted, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, there were many different stages and different forms of interrogatories and ways that you could respond, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And 1 week of oral hearings, actually 7 days of oral hearings this past July, that was available. Anybody, if the public could attend. You could only participate if in the initial submission that you made as a member of the public, you said you wanted to appear. And all of your submissions have to be numbered by the paragraphs and whatnot. It's kind of an intimidating process.
It was streamed as well, I think, wasn't it? At least the audio was. I can't remember.
The audio was streamed. Often CPAC, which is the sort of government cable, covers it, but they did not cover this. And I didn't feel like going across the river to, I live in Ottawa, to Gatineau. So I was like, how can I find out about this? And of course it was Twittered. But there's other ways that the hearings were covered. There's a very big, strong interest in these hearings. Digital policy stuff, how does this covered in the media? People were really excited about this. And in the final decision that the CRTC made in October, they cited that this is how many comments they had, 437 initial comments, 35 replies to those, and 35 final replies. So in these different stages of the process. And an online campaign which was initiated by Save Our Net, resulting in over 13,000 email submissions. One of the interesting little things is how do you get those email submissions, which are often a form letter that is used, although there's an individual name attached to that, actually counted as evidence. So there's been debates about that. And there were 26 oral presentations heard in July. And there was also an oral consult. Ooh. What happened? That's bizarre. There was an oral, anyway, I don't know what happened there, but there was an oral online consultation that the CRTC initiated themselves, which is set up by a guy named Nick Nanos, and there were lots of questions that were asked and comments, and the public could participate in some way. Mark Garneau, who is the Liberal Party digital NDP critic and a former astronaut, very handsome man from Westmount in Quebec, also came out.
My MP.
Was he? Yeah, yeah. So he came out in favor of net neutrality, and this happened. Liberals speak out. This was happening in June. So right before the CRTC, there was lots of interest in this. That is Jack Layton, the head of the NDP, and New Democrats did then introduce a net neutrality bill, time to protect Canada's innovation agenda. That's the big key word here, innovation. And I think that's a really interesting term to unpack. So they came out, and Charlie Angus, the aforementioned who was on the YouTube, tabled this bill, Bill C-398, an act to amend the Telecommunications Act. It's gone nowhere. Of course, Stephen Harper decided that there would be no more Parliament in December, and they just got back. So, you know, all of these bills have sort of died, and they're somewhere, I'm not quite sure. There were a lot of other sorts of forums that happened around Canada about net neutrality. Becky Lentz and I did a little student forum at McGill, and we got a lot of students out there that talked about the issue. Rabble.ca, an online independent news source, progressive, sort of, you know, on this political spectrum, had a lot of articles about net neutrality. And interesting, you know, the language that is used to talk about it, you know, the most important free speech issue of the information age. A series of forums, town halls across the country in major cities, Montreal, Vancouver, Ottawa, Toronto, etc., bringing together some of the usual suspects in Canada to talk about net neutrality and some of the bigger, wider issues. Sponsored by Save Our Net, Campaign for Democratic Media, CIPIC, which is the Canadian Internet Policy Public Interest Clinic at the University of Ottawa, Telecommunications Canada, a community group for community networks across Canada, etc. So a lot of the usual suspects that have been working on digital advocacy, public interest issues for the last 20 years almost in Canada were involved in this. CBC News online had lots and lots of stuff about net neutrality, FAQs, updates, posts and things like this, and did a really, I think, very good public education thing about net neutrality. Here's CIPIC resources. This is kind of very basic. I think this was in a transitional period at CIPIC in terms of who was there, so basic sorts of information and links to other sorts of debates about net neutrality. Michael Geist, who is a very well-known lawyer in Canada that has been a tireless advocate for lots of digital policy issues, blogged about this constantly and created his own blog about this. Facebook websites, Facebook for SaveOurNet.ca, of course, propped up. Oh, and this is the online consultation that Nick Nanos here, who's the only person employed to do these online consultations for the government, set up. And asked lots of questions, and you can look at the transcripts of all of these, of what was said. And I did go into the public record for the CRTC decision. In terms of what happened when the hearings happened in July 6th, there was a lot of excitement about this, and this CBC and other sorts of news sources did cover this. Peter Mansbridge, The National, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are the online, some of the online blips about this day one, net neutrality doesn't exist. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People kept talking about network congestion and bringing up Michael Jackson because his death slowed everything down, ground everything to a halt, so the Michael Jackson effect was continuously evoked.
It's worth saying that this guy put the boxes in the Comcast network that throttled BitTorrent.
Yeah, Yeah.
So he would say that.
Yeah.
Wouldn't he?
Yeah. Yes, he would. But a lot of consumer groups appeared on the first day, which was really great, and they talked a lot about the need to protect privacy and issues of DPI, deep packet inspection. New online services face threat from ISP. CRTC told this is the open internet group, so you've got a lot of the guys coming up, the Google guys in Canada and the Google guys from the States coming up and talking about and actually saying here's a few things that we think you need to do in terms of looking at net neutrality. Throttling could keep independent films from the public. Now, big concerns by content creators because they need to get their stuff out there. And if the internet is a way that everything is being downloaded and distributed, they don't want their content to be throttled. And there's a fear of the Hollywood encroaching continuously. Issues of cultural sovereignty always played a big role. Lots of issues in terms of talking about access for people with disabilities and why it's needed. And this was Canadian Association of Internet Providers. Competition could clear internet congestion, so small ISPs were very concerned about not being trampled by the larger ISPs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. CIPIC gave a big presentation and brought up a lot of experts from the States to talk about the issues that were involved. Steve Anderson, a very young man who's involved in Campaign for Democratic Media. One of the things I think is interesting is his comment here that I put in bold. You have received over 11,000 public comments. This should tell you where the Canadian public stands. The values inherent in the open internet are the values that are attracting widespread citizen support, and I am here as one of those Canadians. That's Steve right there. They're just, as you can see, you appear before the CRTC, and you do need to wear a suit and tie. David Fuhrer of CIPIC talked about the public nature, the public trust involved in the internet and why that should be preserved. New rules are not needed, one of the large ISPs talked about. And then the stunner, day 7, you're rolling around day 7. Bell is grilled all day, the last day, and if you read the transcripts, they reveal details about how they actually do throttle and when they throttle and why they do this. And they kind of are grilled a lot by saying, do you announce this on your website? Is it there? And you can read down the transcripts, and it says, well, the details, they weren't on our website, but they will be there soon. So Bell was kind of caught in the act of doing this. There was a live blog that happened at the same time. Matt Hartley, a journalist at the Financial Post, that was ongoing, and it was quite lively. In the process of this, there were lots of Twitters. There were people Twittering about this, and it was interesting because you could watch the Hartley blog, see that the twits, the twits, and some of the people that were Twittering were definitely twits, and you could see all of these things happening, and people were saying, wait a second, now the Commission is reading those Twitter feeds because they're asking questions that we're talking about. So they thought this could have an influence. Brief things, lots of videos that were produced. This is Matt Thompson, who did the stuff for Free Press, Canada's Internet Explained. So this got lots and lots and lots of views, and here's some images about, talking about this debate and raising, I love the graphics, I love how it evokes certain sorts of tropes in terms of what, Open internet helps community groups and activists. It's good for small business and entrepreneurs. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. And then there's lots of comments from the video, and it sort of debates and stuff like this. So I have like 1 minute to tell you what happened. Decision was released October 2009. Basically requires more transparent policies from ISPs. And any changes related to throttling, network speed, etc., needs to be relayed to customers within 30 days if they're retail and 60 days for wholesale customers. And it needs to be displayed prominently. So it's a consumer issue. And traffic shaping can continue, but it needs to be much more transparent. Describing the nature, purpose, effect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a whole series of basically a framework here of what you have to do and how you have to explain why you are doing what you're doing. They, Deep Packet Inspection, Office of Privacy Commissioner of Canada, did a lot of scholarly work on this, and they basically said, no, DPI in terms of privacy issues, we have to stay away from that. Industry reacted to this. They were moderately pleased. They thought it was okay, a well-considered framework. We got our hands slapped a bit, but we're not too concerned about that. Consumer groups, public interest groups, not that pleased. Tim Wu said it was a typical Canadian decision, compromised. We apologized. We say I'm sorry, etc. So PDAC, Public Interest Advocacy Group, was not that excited about it. One of the issues is, how does the CRTC control it? If a customer has a complaint against an ISP, what do you do about this? Unions weren't that pleased, but it's like, well, okay, maybe it's a step in the right direction. Charlie Angus, hey, it's like the hen in the wolf house, the wolf in the hen house, he said. This is exactly, it's opening up. ISPs can do whatever they want to do. There were a lot of other complaints about it. A lot of people don't like the CRTC. They'd like to get rid of it. I don't know if it's the same with Ofcom, but
some people do.
This is let's
Murdoch again.
Let's fight the CRTC. Let's get rid of it. So a lot of websites and sort of created. This is a mother, and I just I like the internet, but I want the internet to be free. So I started this website, dissolve the CRTC. Here's the petition. Let's get rid of it. It's a bad thing. It's fair and unbiased and all. Latest about the CRTC decision, basically net throttling hasn't stopped. It's continuing, so there's been no real oversight. So that's kind of where it is now in a very quick and dirty nutshell. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thanks to everyone. I'm gonna invoke the moderator's privilege, because I have a question that I'd like to ask that I'm hoping will start a broader discussion. And I would like to see what all of the speakers...
don't do all speak... I was just going to say, we haven't got time to do all speakers' questions. It's only one speaker question.
One speaker question. Okay, so I have a question for Chris in relation to the other things.
Well, that's time out. We probably should ask somebody else. But hey, go on.
Okay, someone can address this question. On the role of basically, these presentations we've seen have all put forth this tension between normative and economic arguments in terms of understanding what net neutrality is, and particularly when we're talking about the role of advocacy, this distinction and tension between normative and economic arguments becomes even more pronounced. And I was looking for some potential comments about that as a part of the phenomenon of net neutrality.
Let me say two things. I want to say one thing about the Canadian process. Canada is so far ahead of where the US and the European Union is.
That's interesting.
The hearing that took place over the course of late 2008 to the middle of 2009 is what the US is now doing and is what the European Union needs to do. So you're way ahead.
Oh, interesting.
You're not as far ahead as people who kill larger animals. So the Japanese and the Norwegians are way ahead of you.
Oh, interesting.
But nevertheless, Canada is way ahead. And in fact, when I was in Washington in September, and they said, well, what should we ask in the NPRM? And I said, well, we've read the Canadian decision, because it's all about, this is what you have to ask. I mean, so they actually did a proper, Steve Anderson, you mentioned, did a proper survey of what kinds of DPI are deployed by ISPs. It's really useful consumer information. So that's just an important thing to bear in mind, because we always think that other places have must have done better than we have, and that's not the case in this situation.
Yeah.
And just the second thing to say is that I just ignore, I'm sorry, but I just ignore the advocacy groups, because anything that's said publicly about this issue simply cannot be important, because anything that, the media does not know how to deal with this issue. It's far too complicated. They like simple stories. They can't deal with this issue at all. And so if you want to see something interesting being said about the issue, you have to go to the experts, and particularly the economists who haven't talked to the technologists talk as much rubbish as the lawyers who haven't talked to the technologists. And so a lot of what, 99% of what's said by people who quote experts is rubbish. It's gibberish. Because they say things like, let's outlaw quality of service. And then they're surprised when most of the network engineers start throwing rocks at them, who they thought they were defending by defending the end-to-end principle. And they suddenly discover life's more complicated than that. So I don't know, I just have a very low opinion of advocacy in this area. Generally.
So you cited ITIF, you don't count them as an advocacy group?
No, what ITIF say publicly is far less intelligent than what they say privately.
I see, so it's just the public statements of the advocates that are not worth that.
Yeah. I mean, the submissions to the FCC or to the CRTC have to be fairly well considered. And that initial inquiry the CRTC did was really interesting, because basically what they said is, Bell Canada as a wholesale provider, which is far and away the largest internet provider in Canada, is is basically traffic managing every single retail ISP, including itself. And therefore it is non-discriminatory because it's throttling everybody. And that's when they said, well, we've got to have another inquiry because all we found out is the obvious, which is they're not discriminating. Well, duh, it doesn't matter that they're not discriminating. That doesn't solve the consumer issue. So, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, more questions.
What is this traffic management again? I know in general terms, but this is obviously a bad thing because always quoted as a bad thing. But what is the traffic management?
Well, it's how you manage and at what speeds internet traffic that flows across the mini pipes.
Dropping peer-to-peer traffic.
What's interesting and bad about it?
Well, look at what Bell Canada does in what it calls quotes traffic management. It only manages during congestion periods. That is 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. 365 days a year. That's totally ill-considered. That's not a congestion period. That's half the year, or just under half the year. So, I mean, you're quite right, Yorick. Everyone does traffic management because everyone has to. The question is then, what is reasonable, non-discriminatory traffic management, and what is allowable? And up until now, most ISPs have just gone, we're not telling you. Because A, it's too complicated for your pretty little heads. And this is them talking to the regulator, by the way, not to the consumers. Because we sure as hell aren't telling the consumers what's going on. I think what's beginning to be much better understood by the regulators is that there is a subset of consumers out there who can make it make sense for the rest of them. And so when you think about the kind of open government data movement, and particularly the work that people like Tim Berners-Lee have been doing, one of the interesting things is that educated consumers, particularly expert consumers, can mash up all this data and really make it come alive for the average consumer. And so the the new European law says this must be and this is one of the problems that regulators are grappling with. This must be understandable for the end user. The end user must be able to get realistic information that they can really use. And of course, the ISPs aren't going to give that. It's not in their interest. I mean, take one example, and Tom talked about the broadband speed code. The All-Party Communications Group last summer had a report on traffic management. And one of it's the one little practical, perfect solution to the broadband speed problem, which was they shouldn't be advertising maximum speeds, because that's laboratory stuff. It doesn't help us. They should be advertising minimum speeds, where there is a realistic possibility of a differential between one ISP and another. What will I be choked down to at 9 p.m? That's what consumers want to know. And so, does this help? It kind of illustrates what really consumers need to see.
It's transparency. There's need for consumer transparency about this. So when I want to download damages, I know when the fastest time to do it is, right? Or something.
Well, depending on what certificate it's got, I can see someone's going to say, there's some movies which will slow down, or if YouPorn is the size of the web in 2005, let's slow that down. I think all kinds of things that public authorities or anybody in charge might do, which they won't tell us.
They haven't got into that, but they have got in what the music industry, of course, would very much like them to do is that they say, look, it's in your interests, ISP, stop all this file sharing and it helps your networks.
There's a lot of unholy alliances.
And the thing is, when you're talking about traffic shaping, by the nature, you are discriminating. So then the question arises, what is unfair, what is undue discrimination, and what isn't? Because the way we define net neutrality at Ofcom is essentially, should there be an overarching principle of non-discrimination with the carriage of different types of internet traffic over networks? That's the exam question. And so far what we've said is that as far as we can see, yes, there is traffic shaping taking place. We haven't intervened to stop that. We think there's a continuing need for it on fixed and particularly on mobile networks. But then there is an issue of where is it harmful to consumer welfare, where do we have to intervene, and what is the appropriate way to do it, whether it's to do with competition, whether it's to do with transparency. And that's the sort of way that we're thinking about it. And it's very interesting because it's not just about throttling people on particular applications, whether it's at particular times or in terms of targeting particular users. The internet is obviously not static, And this is also one of the things that's been unhelpful in the debate, that there has been this sort of talk that net neutrality is somehow defending the open internet, and that it is open at the moment, and suddenly this is all going to be wiped away. The fact of the matter is that, as well as these sort of network management practices that we've been touching on, huge amounts of internet traffic are already being moved from the core through things like content delivery networks, which we haven't talked about at all. Google's a very interesting. Google's effectively now a tier one internet provider who has transit agreements with other carriers. And what it's also doing, it's getting into agreements with ISPs, so that the traffic is carried from their servers directly to the ISP, negating the need to go through any intermediate carrier. And as well as that, they have their own fiber core infrastructure. Yahoo is probably one of the biggest CDN operators out there. And it's very interesting to actually, when we discuss net neutrality, often the focus is on what the ISP is doing, what the telco is doing. But going forward, it's very interesting to see how a sort of net neutrality principle would affect these sorts of companies as well, giving the increasing prominence in this area. So net neutrality could actually work in both directions, and so could regulatory intervention, I feel.
Yeah, and also there's a further aspect of the content provider argument, which is that Disney, of course, is already cutting hundreds of exclusive deals through its ESPN subsidiary with individual ISPs in the US and elsewhere, because Disney absolutely doesn't believe in net neutrality. They have actually a much greater incentive to get away from net neutrality than the ISPs do. Yep. So don't expect that it's all going to be driven by, it's not about evil ISPs and good content providers. It's a much more subtle argument than that.
Yes. I wanted to keep on the topic of the definition a little bit and ask if anyone had any insights or interesting things to share on the name itself. We've used the term net neutrality. Someone told me in the advocacy community in Washington, off the record, that someone who has a lot of experience advocating in Washington, that the net neutrality proponents really won an early stage of the debate by naming it net neutrality. I'm curious if you all have found anything. It might predate your research from this particular topic, but have you found anything on sort of the influence of the name itself?
They lost by calling it the end of end-to-end originally. That was far too clever.
I think I can send you a name. Becky Lentz wrote a PhD thesis looking at the FCC computer inquiries in the 1980s, tracing linguistically how that term came to be. I have not read her thesis, but I will put you in touch with her.
This is recent?
Yes. Yes.
And it was at McGill? She was at McGill,
obviously. Yeah, UTexas Austin, yeah. Yeah, so I think that may have a really interesting clue there.
She's got to publish that.
I would say two things. One is, having advocated around this issue going back to 2006, I actually found the term, and we have found the term a little bit frustrating, and tried to rebrand it as internet neutrality, because in the kind of 2006-2007 period, when all of the a lot of the confusion around definitions was really emerging, there was confusion about, well, how much of the network are you really trying to regulate? Are we saying that cable companies are not allowed to, have exclusive deals with their cable channels, right? Is the full pipe that your cable company is sending into your house going to have to be neutral? And there were some advocates who were advocating for that, and the group that I was with was not. And so we actually found it a little bit frustrating that we were all lumped together in this net neutrality camp, when really we wanted to talk about internet neutrality. And I would also point you to Tim Wu's most recent FCC comments. He's the one who originally coined the term, and apparently in his most recent comments he has coined a new term, which is internet payola, right? Which actually evokes really this concept in Washington, which is really, really compelling, because all of the legislators in Washington know what payola is, and they know they don't like it. And so to kind of say that net neutrality is like internet payola, or lack of net neutrality.
Explain in 10 seconds what it is, Alyssa.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's not a UK term.
It's when the radio stations get paid to air particular content, and it's not allowed. And so he seems to be very good with the buzzwords, I would say, but you might see that one surface in the debate going forward.
Green shirt.
Many people in the room will probably be aware that the Digital Economy Bill passed through the House of Lords on Monday, and it's expected to be passed by the Commons in pretty much its current form. Clauses 14 to 19 of the bill call for a co-regulatory framework to be established for the establishment of various copyright enforcement procedures, including disconnecting users, shaping users' traffic, and blocking specific protocols and websites. I'm wondering, and part of this process is to call upon Ofcom to develop various industry codes for the implementation of these standards. I'm wondering, has Ofcom been involved in any way in the process so far? Is it happy with this arrangement?
Have you tried asking questions like this in public forum? There is a pub to go to.
Generally, how do you think this is going to influence the network neutrality debate in the UK? Will, for example, it muddy the waters and turn it into a debate about copyright enforcement, or will it bring in
well,
you can refer that somewhere else.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, we've been involved. It's fair to say. We were obviously, two of my colleagues actually went on secondment to work on the Digital Britain team. So one of my colleagues sort of disappeared on Friday and wasn't seen again for about another year. He's now a director in our Content and Standards group. And the other guy is now the Public Affairs Director for Lloyd's TSB. So
it stayed in government.
No, yes. There is absolutely a link between. It's almost the flip side. Net neutrality and the copyright debate is the flip side of each other. If you are going to have different types of techniques to facilitate the monitoring and the takedown of particular websites and the blocking of particular protocols, then invariably that means you're not being particularly neutral, that you are sort of facilitating a form of traffic management. I think that is why the government is still quite nervous about any sort of blanket net neutrality principle being introduced in the UK. And certainly that's the sort of impact that we get from our biz colleagues. Equally, though, they will look at sort of industrial policy issues that are well beyond the scope of Ofcom, because they will want to look at the whole value chain, and they will want to see, well, what's in the interests of UK PLC and particular industries. In terms of particular policies, the software industry, particularly the games industry, for example, which is very strong from Dundee University in Scotland. They will also look at network operators. What's very interesting that this is exactly the same thing, I think, that's happening in the debate in the United States. I don't think it's necessarily all about competition. I think there is a strong industrial policy element. And clearly, the software application providers in the US have done very, very well. And they certainly bring in the bacon in terms of tax revenues and in terms of the US economy to a far greater extent than the telcos do. And that certainly gives them a lot of leverage with the current administration. So all these things, you're absolutely right, are sort of tied up with each other. And what's happening now is my colleague Campbell Cowie, who's also in strategy and market developments, he is now sort of leading all the different teams that are now developing the work on these co-regulatory codes. So the work is very much on the way. People are beavering away, and Campbell and I are in regular discussions in relation to net neutrality.
I think I should say that I think that this has gone from drifting before Mandelson to disgraceful under Mandelson in terms of their capture by the copyright industry. If you want to see an example of what is not net neutrality, just look at what Digital Britain says about how to cut off people accused of file sharing. If you want to see what is the most cutting-edge way of dealing with of installing deep packet inspection equipment, look at what BAE subsidiaries are proposing in order to monitor copyright. And I think that, I must say, I think that Ofcom is full of really smart people, and BIS is full of people who are, well, not exhibiting their intelligence in this policy-making process. And that may well just be, I should say, that may well just be because of where we are in the electoral cycle. You know, this is a shockingly bad time to expect intelligence to come out of government. And hopefully things will improve after May. Whoever wins, things will improve after May, because they will have to take a more, hopefully a more long-term view.
To all my BIS colleagues who will be listening to this recording subsequently, I don't necessarily agree with the comments of Chris, guys.
Oh, and I don't mean Nigel.
and we definitely don't mean Nigel.
Right, exactly.
You have a question behind.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Thank you. A question going back to the economic versus normative question at the beginning. To some extent, there is consensus that effective competition policy with transparency, etc., leads or has led so far to something that we call roughly net neutrality. But I think there are reasonable grounds to believe that the economic mechanism that has led to that so far might be in the middle of changing. I'm thinking mainly of over-the-top television.
Mm-hmm.
If that were the case, would regulators like Ofcom or other European regulators, if competition were no longer enough to guarantee net neutrality, would you take an explicit normative position and say, well, if that's not an economic outcome of competition, then we want to make that a specific target of policy, or would you just let the market go where it goes?
Well, no, I think if the market isn't delivering favourable outcomes, desirable outcomes for consumers, and competition isn't working, that isn't, funnily enough, when we start using our powers to intervene. Now, what that intervention will entail will obviously depend on what the particular market circumstances are, but if the market is not intervening, then it's perfectly reasonable, we certainly think in Europe, to intervene in that market process to actually promote competition, as we have done for all these years.
Regarding the normative point, you should be asking, where is the communications consumer panel on this?
Mm-hmm.
Where is their voice in this debate? Because their silence is becoming really quite different.
Well, I think they are seriously considering the issues. They are actually, I'm due to present on this issue to the Communications Consumer Panel in April. They've explicitly asked me, and I think what they want to do is they want to consider very carefully before they come up with a public statement, which I think is a very reasonable thing to do, and I think it's still timely given the timetable that we have both in the UK and Europe. So I don't think that they're silent without cause, and I look forward to actually having discussions not only with the Communications Consumer Panel, who have asked to discuss this issue expressly, but include other consumer groups in due course, whether it's sort of in a sort of pre-consultation phase or during the formal consultation. And I don't think it should be just people like the Communications Consumer Panel and Consumer Focus, although those are all very important groups. But I think it'll be quite interesting to hear from sort of online user groups as well, and I'm sure we're going to get input from them, which will be quite fun.
I'll reiterate my point.
Could I just briefly follow up? So, would you say that if the outcome is not something like net neutrality, then that would necessarily be a market failure? Would you call it a market failure? I mean, couldn't you conceivably have effective, vigorous competition and still have something that doesn't look like net neutrality in 5 years from now?
Yeah, but I don't think we've got net neutrality now, you see.
Sure.
You could also say that if you had genuine competition, it could show consumers just don't care, or certainly aren't willing to pay enough to make it happen, or prefer the tiered banded solution.
Oh, yes.
Example.
Well, one of the very important thing to actually, I think, analyse, and for an evidence-based regulator like Ofcom to engage in, is what the difference actually is of providing information to consumers. Will they actually act on it? I think that's very important. And one of the things I want to do over the summer, and hopefully I'll get budget for this, is to work with the chief economists team to actually conduct a number of experiments using behavioural economics to actually identify how people would behave in certain scenarios given certain sort of information. So I hope to work that into the work that I'm doing.
I am sensing that it is time to wrap things up. And thank you all very much for your participation and your good questions and your attention. Thanks very much to our speakers as well. 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 Thanks very much.